Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine. Welcome to this video series where we are exploring grade 4 from the Waldorf inspired approach. You can find all of the videos down in the description box below, and you can find more information on my website at the blog post that accompanies this video. We're going to dive in and I'm going to share with you a little bit of the Waldorf curriculum for grade 4. There is an extensive review for this curriculum, but I want to share with you some of the main lesson blocks that are in grade 4 so that you can see how you can include other books and resources for each of these main lesson blocks, or dispense with the curriculum entirely and try to create your own. But after I show you everything to create your own, you might just consider getting the curriculum because it's pretty extensive. So the grade 4 curriculum comes with several main lesson blocks. I've added the grade and a little color on the side just because we own the entire set. So this just helps me keep it organized. There are 3 here that don't have anything because they're brand new, because when I went to record the video, I was missing these 3 main lesson blocks. We're going to dive into the Live Education Waldorf curriculum, and I'm going to share with you some of the books and resources that I have collected that can complement the main lesson blocks. And or if you would like to do something completely on your own, I think some of these books and resources might help you achieve that. So the 4th grade curriculum comes with several main lesson books, and you can find a complete review of this entire curriculum. That link is down in the description box below. So I'm not going to spend too much time going over each of these books. I am going to go over the first one, the introduction to the 4th year, because it is so important. And this is really going to explain to you how to do a main lesson block, how to do a main lesson, what's going on with your 4th year child. So around the age of 10, so just at the tail end of the 9-year change and just kind of coming into him or herself. And it's going to go over the additional books and resources that you can use for each of these blocks. And I have more than what's recommended, so I encourage you to choose the ones that are going to best suit your family. I also want to point out that throughout this series, I'm going to be sharing a lot of things that aren't necessarily Waldorf. They are things that we have used. We do use a lot of picture books because I do enjoy them. But first, I want to go over this first main lesson block. This is actually an overview of the whole school year, the student, and how to approach the main lesson blocks and the main lessons. This is such an important resource for the parent, especially if you're less aware of the developmental changes that are happening with your child, or if you're not that familiar with the Waldorf approach. This book is really going to help you understand the arc of the school year, how to do your main lesson, because it's very different from a typical lesson in a typical school setting. And it's going to go over, one of my favorite parts is that it's going to go over the development of your child. And this is so important to understand because the lessons and the stories that are being offered for this year specifically support that development of your child going through these changes. So the 10-year-old child, roughly grade 4, should be at the tail end of the 9-year change, or have completely finished the 9-year change, or is in some part of the process of finishing up the 9-year change. And the 9-year change is quite an upheaval developmental change that occurs that's between 2 very unique and pivotal developmental changes in a child's life. And that's the 7-year change, and then 14, 13, 12, the puberty change. So those 2 are at the beginning and at the end of the majority of the time that you're going to be spending home educating or educating your child. Beyond that, they're going to be in higher education, and some families still choose to homeschool high school with a Waldorf approach. And prior to age 7, a lot of times you're not doing formal education. At least that's my opinion, and also the opinion of the Waldorf philosophy. You're doing more of a play-based approach and less of a formal education approach. So between 7 and 14, you have like almost towards the middle, sort of beginning middle, you have this huge change, and that's the 9-year change. It's a time when children are in a bit of an upheaval. It's where finally time starts to move very rapidly. Before that, time seemed to just stretch on forever. It's a time when children can understand having a past and a present, because prior to this, they lived without the boundaries of time. And certainly you could speak to them about things in the past or in the future, and they may mimic back to you, but the deep understanding doesn't occur until about 9 years of age. And this is a time where prior to this, tomorrow might be, any time tomorrow would be called tomorrow versus next week or next month. It would all just be sometime in the future, and anything in the past might have just been yesterday, but the concept of something that could have passed like a month or a year prior wasn't fully formed for that child. So now at 10, they have hopefully completed that 9-year change. Now time suddenly has presence, and it seems like it's speeding up. And the idea of the child's inner world, which was their entire being, was just themselves in the world, was all just one. Now there's this idea of the outside world and themselves, and where do they fit in the outside world. And it's a bit of a harsh awakening in a way. And so the curriculum is going to help support that change, especially in the stories that you'll find in the animal and man block. You can find other aspects of the math curriculum and the handwork curriculum that really support this developmental change. And if you want more information about the details of this change, you're going to find them in this book, as well as other Waldorf resources that talk about these different stages of development. In addition to the development of the child, you're going to find ideas for the whole main lesson block approach. So a main lesson block is a concentration of a particular subject area that's very purposefully chosen for each of these different grade levels. And they roughly are about 3 weeks, maybe 6 weeks. They're not much longer than that. They're usually not shorter than that either. If they're going to be longer, then it's advised that you split them up into 2 shorter main lesson blocks that you separate between other main lesson blocks. Now, this book has a suggestion on which main lesson blocks to do and which order to do them in. This is either part of the Waldorf approach, or it's something that this curriculum has chosen to do. I follow a little bit of a different approach when it comes to organizing my year and my main lesson blocks. I tend to start with the new, more head-oriented learning, the new learning for the year in the fall, when children, in my opinion, are more fresh for learning. They're excited to be back in school. They're coming off of the high of summer, and they haven't gotten worn out from their daily grind of school. And not that every child is going to feel that way, but I sort of feel like there's this energy at the beginning of the year that I really want to capture. So I tend to do our math main lesson blocks in the fall, when there's a lot of new learning that my children can then practice throughout the year. So I like to introduce the new learning at the beginning of the year for math, and for the grade 4 student, that will be fractions, so that they have the entire year to really work on it. Now, this works in many cases, but if you have a child that might be a little bit behind his or her peers, or maybe isn't quite ready for a math concept that's going to require quite a bit of development and maybe life experience and practice, you might end up choosing to do that math main lesson block towards the end of the year, when that child has a little bit more time to develop. I also like to do my new grammar learning in the fall as well, and that again gives them time to practice those new concepts throughout the year, and especially with grammar and spelling, since the grade 4 student is going to do a lot more reading and writing and narrations. It's good for them to have some of those skills learned at the beginning of the year, because they're going to be using them throughout the year. There's going to be a lot more writing for the 4th grade student than before, and they'll continue doing a lot more writing. But in grade 1, when they're just learning the letters and maybe short words, they might be doing very simple sentences, very simple words. And again, in grade 2, I feel grade 2 is an extension of grade 1 when it comes to grammar and spelling and writing. Grade 3, you'll see students composing their own sentences, maybe doing copy work and dictation. By grade 4, those sentences are going to turn into paragraphs, and each child is unique, and you know your child best, whether they're ready for that a little bit sooner or a little bit later. My children tended to be a little bit behind even the Waldorf approach, which tends to be about a year behind traditional school. At least that's the way I do it. I start our formal lessons at age 7 for grade 1. Rather than grade 6. So my students were typically a little bit behind even the Waldorf approach. It tends to work out in the end, barring any learning challenges or disabilities. But by the time students are getting into grade 4 and 5, they're probably putting together several sentences to make a paragraph. They need to know the grammar and punctuation rules. They need to work on their spelling and vocabulary and general sentence structure and grammar. And so I prefer to do grammar and math at the beginning of the school year so that they can continue to practice that throughout the year. I like to do my history in the winter. I find this to be a really great time to focus on storytelling and just the idea of cozying up. We live in Southern California. There's not much cozying up, but cozying up next to the fire with a good book and reading those stories and doing our history generally in the winter time seems to really work for us. And then in the spring, we like to do our science. And if our year has gotten delayed, as it normally does, because we end up taking longer than we expect and we can't get through all of our sciences in the spring, we will just bump them over into the fall of the next year. And so sometimes we start off the school year with a science and a math. Now, I didn't come up with this idea. I actually learned it from another homeschooler many years ago who worked with the seasons with her lessons, and I loved the idea. And so I incorporated that into our main lesson block approach. So this is going to have a sample of what kind of main lesson blocks can coordinate and which one should follow the other, and then it tells you how long they should last as well. The main lesson is also quite unique in a Waldorf setting. The main lesson can be an hour and a half, 2 hours, or even 2.5 hours long, but you're doing quite a few things in that time. So you're going to start off your main lesson with some opening activities. And the opening activities that we would do in our homeschool involved games or mental math or active math, and I will show you some of the games and the math that we did in each of those videos that coordinate with that subject area. And sometimes we would read a picture book, or you could do poetry in that time. If you are doing a musical instrument, you can practice that musical instrument. If you are working on some poetry, you might be memorizing that poetry. You can use the opening activities time to do that as well. And if you're doing religious studies, any kind of memorization, you might include that in your opening activities as well. So you can see that an opening activities period of time could take a half an hour. I mean, honestly, sometimes for us, it took a full hour before we actually got to our main lesson. And that's good and bad. It's good because you're doing lots of little things in that time. So the children usually don't have mental fatigue. The bad thing is that by the time you're ready to actually engage in a main lesson, children sometimes are done. So be aware of your child's energy level as you're doing your opening activities, and also be aware of children wanting to do the opening activity more than the main lesson, because I noticed that my children would get so engaged in playing the games and realize that if we just played the games for an hour and a half, there would just be no time for our main lesson. And it was still learning, but not on task for what we had intended. So that is this book. You're going to find a lot of these tips on how to put together your main lesson block, and the development of the child. For the main lesson itself, when you have completed doing your opening activities, then you'll get into the actual main lesson. And the main lesson itself has a couple of different aspects. It has a review, has a lesson presentation, a lesson activity. And for me, usually these things would be span over 3 days. And the way that would look like for me is if you just take a lesson itself, you have the presentation of the lesson, you have the lesson activity, which for me would include writing and drawing, and so that's where the 2 days would come in. It could also include an activity that's more hands-on, and when we would do those hands-on activities, usually for me that would span an entire week, and that would be part of our main lesson, but also separate from the main lesson presentation and activity. And then you have your review work, and the review work is really important. And often I would overlook this just to get into the meat of the lesson, but the review work is an opportunity for a student to orally narrate back to you what the previous lesson was about. And this is really important in moving into the written portion of the lesson, because when you orally narrate back, you can see where your child understood something, where they maybe didn't understand something. Maybe there was really big holes in the storytelling, and we're not looking for completion in their narration. We're just looking for what they actually responded to, remembered, and are articulating back to you. The way that looks like in an actual presentation of your week is that on the first day, since there aren't any previous lessons, you're presenting your first lesson. And in that day, you might spend some time in your main lesson book. So I have a few main lesson books here to share with you. I would still be using these large 9-inch by 12-inch main lesson books. These ones have these really beautiful sturdy covers and then blank pages on the inside, blank on both sides with onion skin in the middle. And so on the first day of your main lesson block, you might take that time to decorate your front cover for that main lesson block. So if it's man and animal, you might be writing the title, you might draw a scene. If it was for fractions, you might decorate your page with numbers. And so this will be the first activity that you're doing on the first day, because there isn't review work, there isn't lesson work, there isn't a lesson activity necessarily. There could be, you could start on a project. There are main lesson books that are presented in the landscape orientation, and I still like this for grade 4, but I especially like it for grade 2 and 3, especially when children are still learning how to write and are writing quite with large letters. That working in this orientation gives them a little bit more space to finish words. If it was shorter, they would constantly be going to the next line if their words were quite big. But for 4th grade, this is still an option. In my homeschool, we did both, and it just sort of depended on what we had on hand and what we were planning to draw. By the time they get into 5th grade, I prefer the portrait orientation because that mimics a notebook a little bit more, and so that's the one that we use the most. You also have some smaller ones. These are slightly smaller. They're from a different retailer, and the pages are a little bit different. They're not quite as thick. There is no onion skin between them, and the front and back covers are a little bit thinner as well, more of like a shiny, smooth texture, versus this one is thicker and a little bit textured. Then you could use this for 4th grade, but I would honestly recommend this for 5th or 6th grade. These are the notebooks that have 2 pages of lined pages and then 1 page that's blank. So it's blank on both sides, and then you have onion skin, and then again 2 pages of lined pages. So if you really wanted to use this for 4th grade, you certainly could, but I would recommend using it for 5th or 6th grade. So on that first day of your main lesson, you will be working on your main lesson book to prepare it for the coming lessons. Now, typically in a main lesson book, you will find multiple subjects, or if you were in a classroom, you'll find multiple subjects in the main lesson book. In the homeschool setting, I prefer to do one main lesson book for every subject area. If you were in a school, they might have just loose pages that would all be collected weekly or monthly into one main lesson book, and at the end of the year separated out into each of their own main lesson books. So you can have just one main lesson book that just goes day by day, week by week, month by month, with all your new main lessons in there, because your main lesson book is going to be a collection of your, in a way, your finest work, or your final work, or the work that you really worked on and mastered and perfected. That's going to go into your main lesson book. You can have lots of spare sheets of paper to practice, to do your rough drafts, to work on math problems, but this will be kind of like your best work. So when you are doing your first, or let's say your second lesson, so your second lesson now, you've done your opening activities, which are always at the beginning because they're opening activities. Once you do those, then you'll begin on your review. So your review generally comes before your new lesson and your new lesson work. The review for me generally is oral, or in some cases, it can be the written rough draft of what's going to go into our main lesson. Then you can do your lesson activity or lesson work But on the second day, you may not have that much work to do since it's only the second day of a 3-day learning period. And you can do this as a 2-day learning period and start your work on the second day of at the beginning of a main lesson block. I tended to wait a little bit longer, but that was just my approach. And then at the very end of the lesson, that's when you present your new lesson. So your new lesson always comes at the end for most subjects. For math, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes the new lesson came at a different time in the lesson presentation. But for many of our lessons, the new learning came at the end of all the work that we did. So by the third day, again, opening activities, your review work, then you can start on some kind of lesson activity, either the written portion, the narration of your main lesson, or you can start on your drawing that day, because for many of our lessons, we did include illustrations. And for your illustrations, you can consider using a couple of different art mediums. So I have the thicker Lyra pencils, color pencils here, and these worked really well for us. They still work well for us even in the upper grades. You can also have the smaller Lyra color pencils, which I don't recommend for grade 4 necessarily, but they are available if you are looking just to get one set for many of your children rather than something specific for each child, because these products are quite expensive. Then you could certainly use this, but if you're going to use these kind of color pencils, I find them to be a little bit more challenging to use on a larger format main lesson book. I find them a little bit easier on a smaller format main lesson book, just because otherwise you're drawing so much with just a really tiny tip and it just takes a little bit of time. But if my child was in grade 4, I probably would still be using the block and stick crayons. And these are really great because you can get your drawing done, in my opinion, in a faster period of time. And you still get a fair amount of detail, but in grade 4, you're not needing as much detail as you're going to need in, say, grade 5, when you're working on your botany, and you need a little bit more of a fine tool in order to get the detailed work for the scientific illustrations that you're going to be doing. You can certainly still do a very beautiful watercolor or use your block crayons, but I found that for us, we were doing more detailed work by the time we got to 5th grade, even if we were doing it in watercolors. But these are still a great choice for 4th grade, and we use them often up until 4th grade. And honestly, you can use them beyond, but it's a little bit easier to use those when you're working in your main lesson book, because you can easily get your drawing done without too much time investment, and you're getting a general look rather than a detailed look, because we're still in the end of an imaginative phase in the child's development. So the drawing would be part of your main lesson in many of the subjects, and then you end with the new presentation, the new lesson for that day. So this is the main lesson block approach, and you will do this until the main lesson block is done. And then you will start on your next main lesson block. One resource that will really help you with your drawing and painting throughout the grades, this is for grade 1 through 8, is called Painting and Drawing in Waldorf Schools. This is a tremendous resource. If you are just starting out your journey, I highly recommend you invest in this book. If you head to the grade 4 illustrations and paintings, you can see that the illustrations are quite large. They don't have a ton of detail, especially when it comes to the watercolors. Now for the watercolors, you're probably still going to be using your Stockmar watercolors. These come in these small containers. They are highly concentrated, so you do mix them with water, and then you can use them this way. You don't want to leave them in here for too long because they will start to smell. You can store them in the refrigerator for a period of time to preserve them. Otherwise, I would only just mix enough that you need for the week or 2 weeks at a time. That way you're not wasting your watercolors. And you do want to water them down because these are very concentrated. And then for your paintbrushes, you might be still using your wide paintbrush that was in grade 1, maybe in kindergarten as well. But you can also move to some more like smaller paintbrushes to get some of this additional detailed work. So you can see that the crayons are used here. These are some samples for the Norse mythology main lesson block. And then for the animals and man main lesson block, and you can see the watercolors here as well. So this will end up being a really wonderful resource for you, especially if you're not artistically inclined. This is going to help you along the way teaching your children. This isn't a book to hand to the child so that they can copy these illustrations. This is for you as a teacher, as your own resource in learning how to do these drawings with your children. Now, in the Waldorf curriculum, there is a main lesson block on drawing simple animal forms, and this will also give you some assistance in learning how to draw these different animal forms, since this is a block. The animal study is a block in year 4. I have a couple of resources that might help you understand the Waldorf philosophy and child development a little bit more. I have Children and Their Temperaments, and this is a really great way to understand what you might consider the personality traits of a child, but the temperaments are categorized a little bit differently. And what's really amazing about this that you're not going to maybe be able to utilize as much in a homeschool setting is that in a school setting, when you have 20 to 30 students in a classroom, you have enough variation in the temperaments, enough of the same temperament, so to speak, that they can be grouped together in the classroom so that the parts of the temperament that need to be polished a little bit are best done with another student of that same temperament. So the teacher will generally place those students together so that those aspects can be visualized in someone else, can be observed in someone else, so that there is some recognition that they are that way too, so that those traits can be softened in a sense. So in a homeschool setting, you're not going to have that same opportunity because you have fewer students, let's say, or children within a school setting. So you're not going to have that same opportunity, but understanding the temperaments is really insightful in how you prepare your lessons, for instance, because each of the temperaments, they have a different affinity for different aspects of a story. So there are those children who have a temperament, and I cannot remember which temperament goes towards which one of these characteristics. But for instance, you'll have children, when they are listening to a story or reading a story, are very invested in the details of the food or the decorations or those aspects of the story. Whereas you'll have other students that are very invested in the emotional aspect between the characters or in the heroic adventures of the characters. So you have these different parts of a story that appeal to different temperaments, and knowing your child's temperament and understanding the connection in what they are responding to in a story means that you can include those aspects into your story if you are storytelling, so that you can draw in those students. That's just one aspect to the temperaments that might help you understand your child and their motivations and how you can utilize that in your education. So Rudolf Steiner, The Education of the Child, these are the early lectures on education. This is a book that I went through pretty extensively when we were first exploring Waldorf education. And it really gave me a good sense of the whole picture and what the child was going through and the kinds of lessons that would be appropriate for that child. But it's not a curriculum, and it wasn't the practical information that I needed. It was really great in understanding my child or understanding children and their development, but you will still need more than this. But I found this to be a really great background resource when exploring the curriculum later on, because then you have an understanding of why lessons are being taught, when they're being taught, and how they're being presented, and what stories are being presented. This will give you a lot of that background information. There are other books in this series as well. I think Kingdom of Childhood is the one with the pink cover. I have that one as well, and I cannot find it. And that was filled with notes as well. I might have lent it out and never had gotten it back. So I'm kind of sad about that, because I do tend to write in my books pretty extensively. And then I love reading other people's notes as well. However, there are even more books than these two that can help you understand the Waldorf philosophy in respect to teaching specifically. And while we are mostly I'm assuming homeschoolers, I think the teachers and parents can learn a lot from understanding what is happening with your child, because the stories and the lessons and the presentation of that information is so beautifully aligned with the child that you are, in a way, I feel, utilizing your time the best with the things that are going to be received in an appropriate time, received the best for that time. And that means you're not wasting your time on education and information that's going to need to be revisited at some point in the future because it wasn't that opportunity for that child in that moment. Understanding Waldorf Education, Teaching from the Inside Out. This is a book that I've recommended so much because I feel like it is a great overview of Waldorf education. So if you're brand new to Waldorf, or you've been doing it for a while but you want to explain to someone else, or someone's interested in it, I feel like this is a really great basic overview. I have to admit that it's been years since I've read this because we've been homeschooling for so long. I have recommended it over the years. It is a fast, easy read, and it breaks it down in a very simple way so that you get a good sense of what's happening in Waldorf education. And since these lessons and these videos that I'm sharing with you regarding fourth grade is specifically Waldorf inspired, I think this will be a really great overview of what the philosophy has in store for you. I hope that you're enjoying this series. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information, as well as links to the resources that I am using. You can find the link to the blog post down in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.